I was excited to get going. Let's get going. I had some Toyota Supra uprights. So I cut the ball joint mounts off the bottom of the upright. So you can see here I put it in the lathe and turned down what was left of the upright, ball joint mounted. You can see the two sections I've turned on the lathe now. I then turned down these two plates and put a little step in them so that those parts that I've already turned on the lathe will fit inside. I cut the lower half of the scimitar upright off, you can see the top half of it left here, and then turned out on the lathe a piece of plate steel to fit over the front part of that upright, copied the old brake mount plate I'd made, and then welded on a plate in the bottom. And you can see there the little bit of the old Toyota Supra upright that was left is welded into that lower plate, so I have therefore sort of created a new upright, if you like. So I took the lower wishbone apart from the old scimitar arrangement. You can see the rusty bits here, the two arms. I made the outer half of the lower wishbone here, you can see, and included a bit of an angle section, you can see there as I hold it level, where the Supra ball joint mounts. So you can see the whole assembly here. The upper wishbone bolted to the scimitar chassis is original. The upper half of the upright is original, and then the grey painted part is the bit I've created using Toyota Mark III Supra bits. And the freshly welded part on the attaching to the ball joint and the wishbone is the other bit I've made, with the original wishbones attached to the chassis' original mounting points. Now the trunnion joint is gone, and that suspension setup, as you see it there, is very strong. Here you can see the mounts I've now welded on for the lower connection of the coilover, and then there's the attachments I've welded on the bottom of those assemblies for the anti-roll bar to attach. And you can see the three huge mounting bolts now for the Supra's ball joints. I had those galvanised, painted them all up, polybushed, and assembled that lot. I drove it like that with the new engine in there and all the rest of it for a short period of time before discovering it had enormous bump steer problems. And yeah, it seems that I had messed up the suspension geometry. I'd made the upright taller than original, therefore altering the angles, the relationship between the angles of the upper lower wishbone and the control arm from the steering. So here's a photo illustrating the height difference. You can see the original Trunnion arrangement on the right, and the top of the upright is clamped in the vice look. And you can see my arrangement on the left that I've made is quite a bit taller between the pivot points. So you can see in this photo, the now black component, not grey anymore, is shorter. I chopped a bit off the bottom of it and reduced its height down a bit, so it matched more closely the original setup, which had slightly better suspension geometry. I took everything off, leaving just the stub axle, and took the spring off and just sellotaped the laser to the stub axle and pointed it at a piece of cardboard. You can see the arrangement here. Yeah, the laser is part of a tracking set I was using, but I'm not using it for tracking here. And then I put a series of dots on as the suspension went through its movement. So you can see this is the left side of the car, both of these string of dots, but with the steering turned left and with the steering turned right. And you can see when steering left, the left side of the car suspension behaves itself okay, but when steering right, you can see as the suspension moves, this is for a fixed steering angle, so the steering is all the way to the right. As the suspension moves through its travel, the wheel turns left, and that is exactly bump steer. That is a major issue, so now I had to find a way of fixing it. You can see here I've created a little part which goes between the steering arm and the upright, so this should connect through with two straight bolts. But if you can see the alignment of that black bolt head into the center of the part I've made, and then the steering arm I've angled upwards until the bump steer is eliminated, testing it over and over again with the laser. And from that point I've sent a drill bit in through the left to drill into that component I've made. There it is. You can see that, so the two bolts are not quite lined up now, and what I've done is altered the angle of that steering arm, brought it up a little bit, and that component is still on the car now, serving its purpose, and that has fixed the bump steer issue, so I'm really very pleased about that. But that was it. I eliminated the bump steer. I've got a strong suspension setup now, and it's worked absolutely flawlessly since. What a mission, but there we go. Very pleased with that, I was too. So the last thing to mention, really, I got rid of the Avo dampers, which had a poor sort of bush design, which wore out very rapidly, and then I fitted these gas dampers, which have a lovely design, very strong, and put a plastic cover on them, so they were never going to corrode around the threads. Covered them in copper slip, and then put this plastic cover over them. And 10 years later, and driving in all conditions, really, they're still in fantastic shape. And eventually, I calculated the correct, well, I say correct, a beautiful set of spring rates for the car, which has made it handle fantastically well. And I am so pleased with it. Going from the last video where I cocked the suspension right up, I've now got a strong suspension setup, 4-link at the rear with a Watts linkage, which is standard, and then these height adjustable coilovers, damper adjustable too to match the springs, and calculated tuned spring rates front and rear. With the double wishbone up front, it's actually a pretty good handling machine, and as good as it can be with a beam axle on the back. In principle, you know, the setup is as good as it gets really with a beam axle, and the double wishbones at the front is also as good as it gets, albeit a very old double wishbone set. But yeah, quite a nice steering feel through it. Not quite MX-5 levels or anything, but it's a pretty good handling car considering the age it came from. So I hope you're enjoying these videos, folks. Tune in again. Thanks for watching this far, folks. Really appreciate it.